Donald Trump entered the headquarters of the United States Secret Service, and what he saw left everyone speechless. It was a very cold winter day in Washington, D.C., and inside the headquarters of the United States Secret Service, the tension was at its peak. Agents were busy filing reports, monitoring security feeds, and answering urgent calls. Abruptly, without announcement, heavy doors swung open and a man stepped inside. No security detail, no warning given, just his undeniable presence. The once busy room was stunned silent. Donald Trump had arrived. Agents stopped mid-task, passing, disbelieving glances, as no one had been told he would be coming. Then a voice cut the silence. "Mr. Trump, what do you want?" Trump scanned the room with piercing eyes and an unyielding voice. "I have to find someone, an agent who saved my life years ago. His name is erased from all records. I'm not leaving here without the truth." Heavy silence filled the room. Someone had once saved Trump's life, but where was he now? Was he looking for a forgotten hero or uncovering something never meant to be found? Every eye fixed on him. What he'd said wasn't a question. It was a declaration. Jonathan Reyes, veteran director of the Secret Service, who had been through more presidencies than he could recall, stood up. "You're saying an agent saved your life? Please, Mr. President, go on." Trump nodded, sweeping his gaze across the room as he spoke. "It was 1982. I was a young businessman expanding my empire. Back then, I thought success was all about numbers, skyscrapers, and million-dollar deals. I never imagined that one night I would stand face-to-face with death." His voice drooped, eyes cast far away as if replaying an old, buried memory. The agents in the room just froze. That night, I had just left an important meeting in New York. I got into my car and started driving home, utterly unaware that someone was watching me. As I turned into a narrow alley, an SUV suddenly swerved in front of me, blocking my path. Before I could react, 4 armed men stepped out, yanked open my car door, and dragged me outside. They threw me to the ground, and one of them pressed a gun to my head. I remember exactly what he said. Trump's jaw clenched as he recalled the words. "You think you can walk into our world without paying the price?" Reyes frowned. "Do you know who they were?" Trump shook his head. "At the time, I had no idea. Later, I learned they were part of a powerful criminal organization controlling entire industries in New York's underground. Without knowing it, I had stepped into their territory, and that night, they planned to teach me a lesson or end my story for good." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "If it hadn't been for that man, I wouldn't be standing here today." Shutter. Agents looked at each other. "What man, sir?" Trump breathed deeply, as if gathering himself together. Just when I thought it was all over, a voice sounded out of the dark. "Surrender. If you don't, there won't be a second warning." He snickered and squeezed tighter on the trigger, but the other man squeezed tighter on him first, blowing off his whole hand. Gunshot echoed out in the alley, and this man, still unknown, stood out of nothing and moved before any of the rest could ever get a blink's worth of a chance in on him. Trump's eyes narrowed and glistened. He was an undercover Secret Service agent. Alone, he took on 4 armed men, wounded, outnumbered. But he didn't stop. He pulled me up, dragged me into another alley, and got me out of there. Blood soaked through his coat, but he didn't care. The agents stood there frozen, trying to absorb the weight of his words. When I tried to ask his name, he only said one thing: "Never let them win." I never saw him again. The next day, I tried to find out who he was, but there were no records, no traces. He never existed. Director Reyes exchanged glances with several agents. "Sir, do you remember anything that could help us identify him?" Trump nodded. "He had a long scar on his left hand. I saw it up close when he pulled me to run. And before he disappeared into the night, he said one name. Shadow 1. The room went still. A few agents exchanged uneasy whispers. Reyes took a deep breath. Shadow One is not just a name, sir. Trump's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Reyes crossed his arms, his voice lower, more serious. I've been in this agency over 20 years, and that name, I've only heard it once in my whole career. Trump held his gaze. I don't care what happened. I just want one thing. Find him, or at least find the truth. Heavy silence filled the room. Finally, Reyes nodded slowly. If he ever existed, we'll find him. But in his heart, Reyes knew that this was not a search for a man, but a search that had to do with door that many had been desperate to keep shut for all these years. And once that door opened, nobody knew what was going to happen next. Director Jonathan Reyes paused for a moment and then nodded at the agents in the room. Immediately, the mood changed. The conversation stopped, fingers began to fly across keyboards, and piles of old files were pulled from archives. The search had begun. Everyone knew one thing. If the name Shadow One had been erased from history, this was not going to be an easy mission. Trump folded his arms, glaring at the computer screen as rows and rows of data scrolled past on it. Tell me, Reyes, how can someone who saved my life disappear into thin air as though he'd never existed? Reyes didn't answer right away. He moved to the agent dealing with classified records, a youngish man in a black suit, thick glasses riding high on his nose. Run a full personnel search. Cross-check every classified file, even those that have been encrypted or deleted under government orders. The agent nodded, fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. Strings of code flashed on the screen, searching through decades of government records. After a long pause, he looked up. Nothing. No one goes by the handle Shadow One. Any classified deep cover agents from the 1980s have either had all records sealed or eliminated entirely. If there ever was someone who had that designation, they didn't want to be found. Trump furrowed his brow. What about off-the-record files? Former agents who have served but are no longer in the computer system? Reyes deliberated for a moment, before turning to a female agent standing in the corner. Get in touch with Michael Hayes. He worked in deep cover operations and retired in 1995. If anyone remembers Shadow One, it's him. An hour later, Trump and Reyes sat inside a reinforced SUV driving toward a quiet suburban area in Virginia. Michael Hayes had once been a legend in the intelligence community. Now he was just an aging man living a reclusive life in a small, weathered house. Reyes rapped on the door. No response. Trump scanned the area. The house was ancient, but the windows boasted reinforced locks. A man like Hayes wouldn't stay without security. Reyes rapped harder. Michael, open up. We need to talk. A deep, gravelly voice echoed from within. Go away. I don't have anything to do with you people anymore. Trump took a step forward, his voice firm but laced with sincerity. This isn't about you. It's about a man who disappeared. A Secret Service agent once known as Shadow One. Inside, there was silence, then a soft click. The door creaked open slightly, revealing Michael Hayes. Though well into his 60s, he still wore the air of an operative who had spent a lifetime in the security business. His keen eyes looked Trump over, but there was something else beneath them, something that told Trump this man had seen more than anyone should ever have to bear. Hayes crossed his arms, his voice edged with skepticism. If you're here asking about Shadow One, that means you're either incredibly stupid or you have no idea what you're walking into. Reyes spoke calmly, but firmly. Tell us the truth. Hayes exhaled heavily, then stepped back and motioned for them to come inside. The living room was small, cluttered with old papers and faded photographs lining the walls. Trump's eyes swept across them until they came to rest on one photo in particular. An old group shot of agents in black suits standing at attention, faces stern and composed. But one man stood apart from the rest, his eyes not focused on the camera. Trump pointed at him. "Is that him?" Hayes said nothing for a long moment before finally nodding. "Yes." But his name wasn't always Shadow One. He had a real name once, though by now I doubt anyone remembers it. Reyes spoke slowly, deliberately. "We need to find him." Hayes locked eyes with Trump. "If you're serious about finding him, remember this. There's a reason he disappeared, and if you start digging into this past, there will be people who don't want you to find the truth." Trump didn't blink. "I owe him my life. No matter who I have to face, I won't stop." Hayes looked at him for a long time, then sighed almost violently. He stood and vanished into another room, returning with a worn envelope sealed in plastic protective wrap. He placed it on the table. "This is all I have left of him. But be careful, Trump. Some debts are too great to be repaid without consequences." Trump took the envelope and slowly opened it. Inside was an old photograph and a classified government file still stamped with an official seal. The secret of Shadow One was about to be uncovered, but for every answer, even more questions were waiting. The envelope felt heavier than it should. Trump opened it slowly, revealing an old, worn photograph. The edges were frayed with time. In the picture, a man in a black suit stood among a group of Secret Service agents, but unlike the others, his sharp eyes weren't looking at the camera. He was watching something beyond the frame, as if anticipating a threat no one else could see. Faintly printed beneath the photograph were the words, "David Cole, United States Secret Service." Trump turned to Michael Hayes, his voice slow but resolute. "Is this him?" Hayes nodded. "His real name was David Cole, one of the best agents I ever knew. But he wasn't just any agent." Reyes furrowed his brow. Hayes took a deep breath and let his eyes wander. Age seemed etched only in those who understood well why it was so. David didn't just work for the Secret Service. He infiltrated one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in the country. He took on assignments no one else dared to. He gathered evidence of corruption at the highest levels, illegal deals between the government and underground organizations. Trump tightened his grip on the photograph. "So that's why he was erased from the system?" Hayes nodded. "No one wanted a man like David Cole to exist. The people in power made sure his name would never appear in any official record." Reyes crossed, his arms, his voice low and steady. "If he's still alive, why hasn't anyone been able to find him?" Hayes locked eyes with Trump. "Because he doesn't want to be found, or worse. Someone made sure he never would be." Silence filled the room. Then Trump rose from his chair, determination burning in his eyes. "We're going to find him." Hayes exhaled heavily. "If you're that determined, I have a lead, but it's not safe." Trump didn't hesitate. "I don't care." 3 days later, Trump and Reyes arrived at a remote area on the outskirts of Chicago. It was a sharply cold night that cut like a knife, and the narrow dirt road took them deep into the forest to where a small wooden cabin was isolated in silence. Reyes's hand instinctively went to his waist gun, then motioned to Trump to halt. "We don't know who's in there. Let me go in first," Trump said. Shaking his head, Talbot intervened. "I'll speak to him myself." They walked up to the door. Reyes knocked 3 sharp raps, no response. Talbot pushed forward, his voice piercing the gloom. "David Cole, I know you're in there." Silence, then a faint click. The door creaked open just a crack, and 2 wary ancient eyes peered out from the shadows. David Cole. His face was gaunt, his beard streaked with silver, his frame leaner than the man in the photograph. But his eyes, those same piercing, battle-hardened eyes, had not changed. He was still a man who had once stood at the edge of life and death. Trump met his gaze unflinching. "I've been looking for you for 40 years. He didn't say anything for a long time, then slowly pushed the door open wider. "If you've made it this far, it means you truly want answers. Inside the cabin, the dim glow of an old lamp cast long shadows across the room. Stacks of yellowed newspapers and scattered documents covered the table, the headlines revealing traces of past political scandals, names Trump recognized, yet details he had never seen made public. David sat down, his eyes never leaving Trump. "I saved you that night because I knew if you died, the story would end there. But I never expected you'd be the one to come looking for me." Trump clenched his fist. "Why did you disappear?" David smiled quietly, with no humor. "Because I got too close to the truth. I had evidence. Evidence nobody wanted to see. And when I was ready to expose it, they set me up. A staged attack, a secret arrest warrant, and overnight, I became no one." Trump's voice dropped, steady and resolute. "I can't change the past, but I can fix what was done to you." David raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you think you can do?" Trump rose from his seat, determination burning in his eyes. "I will bring your name back. I will make sure the world knows who you are and what you did." David shook his head. "You don't understand, Trump. The people behind this still hold power. If you dig up the past, you won't just be putting me in danger, you'll be risking yourself too." Trump held his gaze, unwavering. "I'm not afraid." A long silence filled the room. Then David exhaled, as if releasing the weight of 40 years. He stood up, went to the old wooden cabinet in the corner of the room, and opened it. He withdrew a little metal box and set it on the table before Trump. "If you're really going to do this, then here's everything I've kept for 40 years, he said. Trump opened the little box. Inside were classified documents, audio recordings, and photographs, everything David had discovered before he disappeared. Reyes scanned the papers, his look changing as he turned to Trump. "If this is actual, it all changes." He nodded, shaking his head unconvinced. "Then we're doing this." David observed him for a moment. For the first time in their exchange, he even smiled. "You really never know when to quit, huh?" Trump only shook his head. "Men like you don't deserve to be forgotten, and I'll make sure that never happens." That was the declaration that marked the official beginning of the battle for the truth to be brought out into the light. David Cole sat in his small cabin and stared at the metal box lying on the table. Inside, he had parts of his life that had been buried, a past full of secrets that could alter everything. For 40 years, no one had dared to touch it. No one had dared to speak the truth. Trump stood beside him, his eyes never leaving his. "If you're ready, I'll make sure the world knows what happened." David slowly closed the box. "Once this gets out, there's no turning back." Trump didn't blink. "I've never been one to back down." Silence filled the room. Then after a long pause, David gave a slow nod. "Okay, let's do this." 4 days later, in Washington, D.C., a press conference was held right in front of the United States Secret Service headquarters. Cameras from every major news outlet focused on the podium. Trump stepped forward, and behind him, David Cole stood in silence, facing the public for the first time in 4 decades. Trump scanned the crowd, then spoke, his voice unwavering. "Today I stand here to tell the story of a man America should never have forgotten, a man who was willing to sacrifice everything for justice, only to be erased from history. The entire room fell silent. Trump continued, "David Cole, a former Secret Service agent, dedicated his entire career to fighting against corruption and evil. But when he got too close to the truth, those in power made him disappear. They thought that by erasing his name from every record, they could make the world forget him. But today, I stand here to tell them they were wrong." Trump turned to David. "You were forced to live in the shadows for too long, but from this moment forward, America will remember your name." David looked at Trump, saying nothing, but in his eyes something had shifted, a weight lifted, a sense of relief he hadn't felt in 40 years. The next day, the sitting president signed a special executive order. David Cole's honor was formally reinstated. he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the most prestigious honors a U.S. citizen could receive. A ceremony was conducted at the Secret Service headquarters, and his name was etched on the Wall of Honor among other agents who had dedicated their lives to protecting the nation. And as David stepped forward to accept the medal, the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding. No ghost this. He was a hero. And finally, America realized it. And then came the trump card. 1 week later, a scholarship fund named the David Cole Foundation was announced, dedicated to assisting former agents and their families during hardship. News stations all over the country reported on the event, and David Cole's story spread like wildfire. Other forgotten agents, those who had sacrificed in silence, were finally being remembered. Their stories were being told. David stood by the window of his small home, watching the golden sunlight filter through the glass. For the first time in years, he felt like he truly existed. As Trump prepared to leave, David spoke only one sentence. "Thank you, Trump, not for the honor, but for remembering me." Trump simply nodded. Men like you should never be forgotten. And with that, he walked away, leaving behind a man, a story, and a legacy that the world would never forget. David Cole's story is more than the tale of a forgotten agent. It is a reminder of those who still stand for justice in the face of power and silence. But more importantly, it shows that an overdue thank you and a small act of kindness can be very influential in changing someone's life course. David Cole dedicated his life to protecting his country, but nobody knew of his sacrifice for 40 years. If Trump had not dug him up, such a story would have stayed in the grave forever. How many others out there have given everything without being recognized? How many heroes faded away without anyone noticing? Today, we are not engaged in battles, great and small. Every day gives us the chance to remember and honor those who have made sacrifices for us, people like David Cole. If someone has ever helped you, find them. Thank them before it's too late. Don't let their kindness, their sacrifice be forgotten. And if this story moved you, share it. Let more people know that justice only exists if somebody is courageous enough to stand up for it. Together, we can keep stories like this alive. And if you loved powerful and inspiring stories like this video, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share with all those you know, because sometimes when a story is retold, it can change a life.